All right, folks, we're getting ready to roll here. So this is the second part of the intelligence workshop. Jason Mutschler, previously emerging solutions consultant with experience out in the field, now moved into product management, is going to talk about a couple of breaches and do some deconstruction on what's going on and take a look inside what the bad guys are doing. So.
All right. Thank you, Brian. So, what I hope you guys all get out of this are, we're going to go over some common approaches to breach conventional security controls within organizations, as well as practical ways to leverage intelligent IAM to reduce vulnerabilities and detect and respond before business loss within your organization. Also, what you can do about the current threats and why you should care. So who's getting breached? There have been a lot of high-profile breaches in the news lately, including the eBay breach, Neiman Marcus, Target. Most recently, I've seen the Houstonian Hotel lost about 10,000 credit card numbers, and the United States Office of Personnel Management was broken into recently, and they've said so far that they're basically unsure if they lost anything. So the rate of these is increasing over the past few years. I think last year there were about 2,000 of these breaches and many millions of records were lost. So who's trying to get in and take these things? It's a mixture. There are a lot. The large majority are perpetrated by external actors. So cyber criminals, people that are working for individual nation states, and other actors as well. There also still is the possibility of the insider threat. Makes up a much smaller portion of the breaches, but it's still something that you need to be vigilant about. And what are these people after? Money, fame. They're looking to grab your credit card information, your PII, your personally identifiable information, protected health information, basically anything they can sell or use as publicity. So we'll go into a case study. There's a lot of information out there about the Target breach. It's a very good example of the types of things that are going on out in the field. A lot of the same types of things are happening in the other situations as well. In this specific case, cyber criminals were looking to get in and take personally identifiable information and credit card information for as many people as they could get. So, what happened? In about September of 2013, Target was certified as being PCI compliant. Around the same time, attackers broke into one of their HVAC vendors, Fazio Mechanical, I believe, and they were able to get some credentials there that allowed them to log into Target's network. Now, typically, that should only give you some sort of limited access. The contractor was only supposed to be able to enter their time or submit contracts, things like that. And the payment systems network under PCI guidelines should be completely segmented or should require a second factor of authentication. So the attackers then used those credentials to get into Target. They spent some time looking around and they moved laterally within the organization. They started to install their malware. They modified it to be used on Target's homegrown point-of-sale systems. That malware was able to collect unencrypted data from memory, including full credit card numbers and things like that as they passed through the system. They spent a few weeks in there installing this malware and kind of perfecting it, getting it across all of the POS systems. Sometime around Black Friday, they had it installed on the majority of systems. It happened to be a great time for them. It's a high volume time for credit card transactions in most US retailers, including Target. And they were able to capitalize on that through the holiday season. About a month later, the Department of Justice notified Target. It took some time after that for Target to figure out what was going on and clean up the issue. They continued to accept credit card transactions. 4 days after that, they started to acknowledge the breach and publicly disclose how much information was lost. There was around 40 million credit and debit card numbers. And sometime after that, in January of the following year, this year, they also confirmed that the attackers, while they were in there, were also able to get their hands on a database containing personally identifiable information, names, addresses, phone numbers, all that, on 70 million people. So, what do we know? The track data was collected for approximately 40 million credit and debit cards. What does that mean? It means they were able to get the credit card numbers and all the other information on the magnetic stripes of those cards. They did not get the CVV2 numbers, the codes that are printed on your card, that they would need to use those credit cards to buy things online. So they would have to take the track data, encode it onto new cards, and then use these cards physically in person to make transactions. Target also lost encrypted PIN numbers for the impacted debit cards. So the information's encrypted. It should take a while for somebody to figure out how to get into it, but ultimately it's reversible and somebody will figure it out. Again, they also collected personally identifiable information on an additional 70 million people through a separate database, and the attackers were able to modify their malware to work with Target's homegrown point-of-sale system. So the breach process, the attackers used an HVAC vendor account to get in initially, but it really doesn't matter how they got in the door in the first place. Once they got in, they were able to exploit some weaknesses in Target's security and move laterally through the network to the payment systems. Once they were there, they installed their malware and they used the best one user account, which is an account that ships out of the box with a lot of BMC products, to upload that data all to a central server within Target for exfiltration. So, in terms of the machines that they had control over basically all of the point-of-sale systems. They had to install the malware directly on those to collect the data as it moved through the network. The malware would then upload that to other machines within the network, where it would be batched together and pushed out to some other external machines they had compromised, where they'd pick up the data. So the malware. The attackers used Black POS, which is a product which is available on a number of underground cybercrime forums. It's sold for somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,000, and they took a version of this and modified it to work with the data they were seeing in memory at Target. So what does it do? It scrapes the unencrypted track data while it's in memory. Some of the more recent versions of this run as a service rather than just as a process within Windows. They've improved the pattern matching within the tool to make sure they're getting all of the data they're looking for. It also checks for duplicate records, so they're not uploading more information than they need. And it tries to masquerade as kind of normal business file share traffic. It only moves the information it collects once a day, sometime between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., a randomly selected time, to blend in with some of the peak traffic during business hours. It also tries to hide itself by being named SVC hosts, similar to the built-in SVC host Windows process, to try to avoid detection. Before Target was breached with this, there was some guidance put out by Visa, actually on 2 separate occasions, that called out this type of malware and how it could be used to attack merchants. They, in April 2013, warned of this capability, and in an update in August of 2013, recommended some additional controls so organizations could protect themselves, potentially. A lot of those things were in line with the PCI guidelines, so concept of least privilege, strong passwords, those sorts of things. So how could Target have stopped this? There are a number of ways, but we're increasingly seeing that the left of the attack portion on this, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, is a little bit tougher. So the attackers are going to find a way into the organization. That's an assumption we have to make at this point. Once they're in, how can you stop them? You have to look for patterns of use, things that are abnormal. And you can hopefully pick them up somewhere as far left in the cyber kill chain as you can. Ultimately, you want to get them before they start to exfiltrate your data. If not, you want to pick up that activity as soon as possible and stop it before they get more. So, what can you do? You can use tools to reduce your threat surface. Look for things like abandoned accounts within the organization. So these are things like contractor accounts that may be hanging around. In Target's case, maybe that contractor account was no longer being used, maybe it still was, but you don't want to be leaving these things hanging out there for any longer than you need. This is a big problem we see in a lot of organizations. When we go in, we see people leave contractor accounts active even though the people haven't logged in months or years. If a breach happens at one of those organizations and somebody stored the credentials for your account improperly, they have an easy way in. You should be looking for ungoverned accounts. So things within the organization that don't have an owner. So if you can't figure out what an account's for, you should be investigating it and remediating those accounts, or at least assigning an owner and having somebody attest to the need of that account. Privileged access. Can anybody really say that they understand who has access to all of the privileged entitlements in their organization, including through things like nesting? Once we start to look at the nesting within an organization, we see a lot of accounts that have access to these privileged entitlements through paths that are unexpected. It could be a group within a group within a group, which gives you access to log into all the domain controllers within the organization. These are things that you have to be vigilant about, and having a way to monitor for them on an ongoing basis is very important. And then finally, unused entitlements. So these are tough to look for in an organization typically. Nobody wants to really remove entitlements once, or at all, just because they fear they're being used for something and it's tough to justify. So even through nesting, we can give you the visibility into who's using these things. They're potentially a security risk, especially if they give you some level of privileged access through nesting. If somebody went to reuse those groups later on, they could potentially give people access that they didn't intend. So what else can we do? We can demonstrate that the right people have the right access to the right pieces of information and that they're doing the right things with them. It's a fairly broad statement, but through some of these visualizations, we can start to look for individual problems and whittle down the things that people are doing to get inappropriate access or move laterally through an organization. So should somebody in your customer support department really have administrative level access? Probably not. Are you ever going to be able to pick it up if it's nested through 3 or 4 layers? Something like the example over on the left, everybody in the support group has access to the account operators group. Should everybody in that group really be able to make modifications to accounts? Can you get a clear and accurate picture of all of these things? So we're seeing these the same patterns within a lot of the breaches that we've looked at. So Neiman Marcus, that breach, they used similar malware to what was installed at Target. It was actually, I believe, another variant of the Black POS. We're seeing people are getting into these organizations through a variety of ways. What really matters is what information can they get once they get in. And that's really it. Move pretty quickly through those. So does anybody have any questions around this or any of the other breaches that have been in the news recently? Yep.
Technical question. Are there tools available for counting and visualization of access so organizations are not left below trying to flow through the maze of entitlement?
So we have a tool called Access Insight, which a lot of those visualizations came from. We'll be doing a demo of it in the next session. And that's one way to get at all of those relationships. We'll explode all the group nesting so you can start to see how people have access to things and see these webs. We'll also set up you can also set up policies around some of these things. So if a new account or new user gets access to privileged entitlement, for example, you can be notified or take some action on it. Does that address the question? Okay. Yes?
You used the AB nested group as an example, talking about this nesting community.
Yep.
Can you talk about how do you correlate access across layers, division layer, AB layer, use layer, all the different layers?
So,
What is someone have local access?
so how do you correlate this stuff across multiple systems?
So data come to view of
Yep. We'll actually go into that a little bit more in the next session too. You'll see, if you look at the example up on the screen, we have that account tied back to a user. This is kind of an account-centric view. We also have these views based on an entitlement or a user. So you can search for a specific person, see all the accounts that they have, and then all the access that they have on those accounts and surf through the web. If you start to pull in data from other systems too, you could mark entitlements in Unix as privileged or anything like that, and use the same tools to cover the same issues across other systems.
Follow up on that a little bit.
Yeah.
The other piece of that, you know, when you talk about federated identity, right, where now you have sort of somewhat loosely coupled systems, right, where I have one application that is relying on the identity that's coming from somewhere else. And you actually have to look at both of the sides of the equation and correlate them to really understand and be able to get the full picture, because it's not really sufficient to say, okay, I understand this identity, and I understand that the access that's assigned to this identity. That's part of the picture. But what you really want to understand is, I have an identity, who is the person attached to that, and then what are they allowed to do? What access is assigned to that? And to answer that question, oftentimes you have to go from the identity provider to the security model that may be loosely related to another application that might have a three-tier security model, and then ultimately to the assets. And when you throw in things like inheritance, or the breaking of inheritance, where, let's say in the unstructured data world, permissions are set at the top level, but down below I can break the inheritance and reassign it. That makes it more complex. And that gives you the picture of access assigned, and then sort of the next step beyond that is understanding access used. And that's where the activity dimension comes into play, right? So these guys are exploiting the, I would say, incorrect assignment of access, and then they're starting to do unusual things. And the trick is closing the assigned access part of that, so you have less risk, less surface area, and then you try to catch the weird activity that's going on. But you can see from what Jason was talking about, the malware is getting smarter and smarter. Let me install and try to exfiltrate during your most critical time in your business, where I know you're not going to be willing to shut things down. Let me try to make the activity look like it's a user activity or a slow trickle of data out. But even outliers, whether the outliers are a big spike in activity or a low spike in activity, can tell you some interesting things. Yep.
Yep. So I was having a little bit of trouble hearing you, but your question was, have we come across a customer where we found kind of a weakness within the network where people can move laterally, or is that correct? Yeah. So we focus primarily around the access that users have and the access related issues. So we've found things like there are too many users who have access to perform administrative tasks or to log into this area of your network. We're not really looking at the separation of the two networks via firewalls or something like that.
Yeah, the area that we're looking at is all focused on identity and access and activity, right? So I think in that regard, if there was network activity that we could ingest, that would be interesting to us. There's probably, are a whole set of solutions out there that are looking at doing analytics, this kind of stuff, analytics and intelligence around network devices, right? So this concept that, of being able to ingest a lot of data, relate it, understand it, and relate elements that are loosely coupled can be applied in a lot of different areas. And the area that we're focused on is identity. But these kind of techniques get used all over the place to predict, to look back in history, to see what happened, and to try to detect things and see things that you can't see today, to look for interesting trends and patterns. And this really allows you to take what's happening under the covers, you ingest this data, you get it into a cube with a lot of different dimensions, and you can start to rotate it and look at the data from different perspectives, and then that's when you start to really see and uncover interesting things.
I'd like to add something to that, if I might, your comment.
Sure.
Sorry, Andrew Ferguson from Cool, the analyst company. there is actually quite a lot of interesting developments happening across industry. Different groups like the MAP consortium in terms of using policy-based access control and entitlements for network access. So there is some activity there. There's obviously a lot of synergy between the vendors and the market space around that coming from the Xactimel world. Obviously there's some people here, I think some vendors here are going to be talking about that space over the next couple of days. And I think the interesting thing is this drive, if you like, to do policy-based provisioning, policy-based deprovisioning, policy-based transfer of data across multiple domain networks. A lot of stuff happening in the government here in the US now, of course, with the federal RAN. There's a whole bunch of activities happening in that space. And of course, there's also it's the same issue being faced by the health sector and in terms of providing better privacy controls on all of these simple issues. I'm actually from Australia. You may be able to tell from my accent. We just had new legislation enforced in Australia for privacy identity to protecting identity information in inadvertent disclosure and access to these things. Luckily, Target in Australia wasn't affected by Target in the US, so but it was pretty horrific. I can tell you being the concern of what's happened on that data breach.
Yeah, this whole notion, there've already been, workshop sessions talking about, all the other things in the world that are going to have identity and all the other things in the world that are going to need to have an access control model around them. I mean, at some point when your refrigerator comes online on the internet, what are the bad things that can happen if a bad guy gets onto your fridge? Turn off the power, ruin your food, stink up your house. This identity and access conversation that we're having, it's not going away. We all need to manage the least priv. That's what allows us to control. That's what allows us to manage our risk, whether it's a device, person, or service account even. Yeah, right. What's that? Yeah, see, there was the comment was, deactivating your home alarm system, and I think yesterday there was one where the hackers hacked into a Tesla.
Yeah.
And I don't know what they did. Did you see it? What they ended up doing? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think they broke into the app that there's a phone app that can control
Right.
a lot of those functions.
Right. But I mean, that gets back to the previous session where we said, the bad guys, they're going to get in with whatever path gets them to the information that they want to get to. And it doesn't matter. They don't have to break into the car if it's easier to break in
Right.
to the application, right?
Yep. All right.
Other thoughts, questions? Yep.
I'm sorry?
Just wondering, you talk about how would you correlate the user access with like the network log management systems and SIM systems, the event system. How do you correlate those information to the
Okay.
Right. So the question was about correlating this kind of information with the kind of information that SIM systems produce or even collect. So that's the thing that's an area that we have been looking at. So if you think, and it's not just SIM systems, but there are other applications that companies have that could be interesting for this kind of these kinds of analytics. But so for SIM, a lot of the value that those solutions provide is they have their own aggregation and their own analytic capabilities. So now the question becomes, are these two analytics where the SIM systems had historically been working with, I would say, device types of information, log information, and they were oftentimes trying to correlate and look for attacks. We're looking at identity and access. We're kind of looking at different sorts of information. So the use cases we've been looking at have been, what's the value that the SIM system has? What's the context that they have that is interesting to feed into a solution like this, which is looking at identity and access? And so the short story of that is when the SIM systems see an event of interest, they raise an event, that could be a piece of interesting context to float over to this kind of system, which is looking at identity and saying, does this event relate to identity and access? And is it something that we care about? And is that going to change the risk profile of the person who's associated with that event. That's one option. The other option is we're doing a lot of risk calculations, right? So our idea of risk may be different than the risk profile that the SIM system has. So if we know, based on the context that we have, that the person associated with that event is in the finance department, we might raise the risk of that event a little bit. And so that can be information that we feed back into the SIM system to enhance the analytics that it's doing. That's one path. The other path is just the SIM system has already aggregated a whole bunch of context. If that context is interesting, then we could ingest from the SIM system, meaning we have only one connection point, rather than having to connect to the same 100 places that the SIM system is already connecting to. And that's one example. There's other examples. Data loss prevention products have a similar sort of bi-directional connection story that makes sense.
Right, so the reason I asked the question to figure out more from the perspective of looking at these systems with a single part, information from DOT from STEM to produce some kind of report, or would you actually, since this is IM analytics, right?
Yep.
Would that be more appropriate to feed the IM intelligence to the DOT?
Right.
STEM to provide more information.
Right. So I think the question was, which one of these analytic systems would be authoritative or at the top of the food chain, right? Is that the question? Right. So you have SIM systems doing one kind of analytic, you have intelligent or IAM systems doing another kind of analytic, you have DLP systems going off and scanning unstructured and structured data repositories and classifying data. They're raising incidents. Which one feeds which one, and who should be authoritative? And I think in a lot of cases that's up to the customer to decide, what systems they want to work in. And you're going to have different people probably interested in having one system be more authoritative than the other. The short answer, I think, is that in all of those scenarios, there is a good value exchange in both directions from those systems. So either one would be authoritative for a different purpose. The other dimension, just to throw a little bit of a wrinkle into your question, is customers say, hey, that's all great. You could have a cool dashboard, and SIM could have a pretty cool dashboard, but in my company, I use Cognos. And I want everything to float into Cognos because that's my dashboard. And so we've definitely heard that people say, great, the analysts and the administrators, they might use your interface, but in the end, it's all going to float into Cognos because that's where my, CISO and their analysts are going to be looking at things. Any other questions? Thoughts? All right, great. Well, we'll be around for the rest of the day. The final session in this workshop, Jason's going to go through and he's going to start to do some of the analytic stuff live for us. And so we'll see what the results look like and see what kinds of things we can uncover.